In the winter of 1861, it began to rain on California, and it did not stop. For 43 days, storm after storm rolled in off the Pacific and slammed into the state, and by the time the skies finally cleared, California had been transformed almost beyond recognition. The entire Central Valley, a stretch of land 300 miles long, had vanished beneath a single, vast inland sea, 20 miles wide in places, deep enough to drown telegraph poles up to their crossbars. Downtown Sacramento, the state capital, sat under 10 feet of water. The newly elected governor, the story goes, had to travel to his own inauguration by rowboat. Thousands of people drowned. Something like a quarter of the state's entire cattle herd was swept away and lost. And the young state of California, barely a decade old, went effectively bankrupt, unable to collect taxes on a third of its land because that land was underwater. The scale of it strains belief. Contemporary accounts describe being able to travel by steamboat across the drowned valley for 100 miles, sailing over what had been farms and ranches and roads. One prominent surveyor of the era wrote that America simply had no conception of the destruction, that the entire heart of the state had become a single sheet of water. Native communities that had lived along the rivers for thousands of years were devastated. Livestock died by the tens of thousands. Miners, farmers, and whole towns in the foothills were washed away in the night. For weeks, the ordinary business of an entire state simply ceased to exist, because the state itself was, in a very literal sense, at the bottom of a lake. And then, over the decades that followed, something strange happened. The whole catastrophe, the greatest natural disaster in California's recorded history, was very nearly forgotten. The waters receded, the survivors rebuilt, the valley dried out and turned green and fertile again, and millions of people moved in over the following century and built cities and farms and highways across the very ground that had once vanished beneath that inland sea, most of them never knowing it had ever happened at all. This is the story of the Great Flood of 1862, and of the growing scientific warning that it was not a freak, once-and-forever event at all, but simply the most recent occurrence of something that returns to California again and again, that is arguably overdue to return right now, and that a warming climate is quietly making more likely with every passing year. Scientists have taken to calling the modern version of it California's other big one, and almost no one has ever heard of it. Let me be completely clear about what this is, and what it is not, right at the outset, because in a world full of false alarms, it matters. I am not telling you that a megaflood is bearing down on California this week, or this year. There is no monster storm on the horizon tonight, no evacuation underway, no emergency unfolding as you watch this. What I am going to walk you through is something different, and in a way more important, a real, rigorous, scientific scenario, one built by the United States Geological Survey and later sharpened by climate scientists, describing a specific kind of catastrophe that California is genuinely, historically prone to, that has struck the region many times over the centuries, and whose odds are quietly, measurably rising. This is not a forecast of a coming storm. It is a warning about a sleeping giant, and the very first step in ever dealing with a sleeping giant is simply knowing that it is there. So let me take you back to what actually happened, because the reality of 1862 is difficult to fully absorb. The rain that began in December of 1861 was not a single storm. It was a relentless, weeks-long assault, and in some parts of the state it dumped close to 10 feet of water. Rivers that normally ran quiet and shallow swelled into raging brown torrents that tore out bridges, roads, and entire towns. The great Central Valley, the flat, fertile heart of California, ringed by mountains, became a catch basin for all of that water pouring down out of the Sierra Nevada, and it filled up like a bathtub. What emerged was a temporary sea, running roughly 300 miles from the top of the valley to the bottom, in places 20 miles across. People fled to rooftops and hills. Whole communities were simply erased. Down south, large portions of what is now the sprawling Los Angeles metropolitan area flooded as well, and nearly every narrow river valley in the state ran wild. It was, by any measure, an apocalyptic event. And the single most important thing to understand about it is this: it was not unique. It was simply the last time. Because the most sobering part of this entire story did not come from old newspapers or diaries. It came from the mud. Scientists studying California's flood history did something clever. They drilled down into the sediment at the bottom of the state's bays and coastal basins and river valleys, and they read the layers, because a truly enormous flood leaves a distinct signature in the earth. A thick band of debris washed down from the mountains and laid down all at once. And when they read those layers, stretching back nearly 2,000 years, they found the unmistakable fingerprints of megaflood after megaflood after megaflood. Great floods, comparable to or even greater than 1862, had struck California in the years 212, 440, 603, 1029, around the year 1300, then 1418, 1605, 1750, 1810, and then, most recently, 1862. Sit with that list for a moment. These catastrophes recur, on average, something like every 1 to 2 centuries. And here is the part that should genuinely stop you. Of those ancient floods, at least 6 of them were even larger than the one in 1862. The Great Flood that bankrupted California and drowned its capital was not even the worst that this land is capable of producing. And the last one was more than 160 years ago. Which means that on the long clock of geology, California is not overdue for a megaflood in some vague, hand-waving, alarmist sense. It is squarely within, and by some reckonings, already past, the window in which these events have reliably returned throughout history. The Great Flood of 1862 was not a fluke of nature, it was a heartbeat. And the heart has been quiet, now, for an unusually long time. So what actually causes a disaster on this scale? The answer is one of the most remarkable and most underappreciated. Features of the entire planet's weather system, atmospheric rivers. They are exactly what the name suggests, rivers in the sky. Long, narrow, invisible corridors of concentrated water vapor, sometimes thousands of miles in length, that stream through the atmosphere and carry staggering quantities of moisture from the warm tropical Pacific toward the coastlines of the world. And the amounts of water they move are almost hard to believe. A single strong atmospheric river can transport more water through the sky, moment to moment, than the Mississippi River carries on the ground, sometimes many times more. Now, most of the time, these are not a threat at all. In fact, California depends on them. A healthy atmospheric river sweeping in from the Pacific drops the crucial rain and the deep Sierra snowpack that fill the state's reservoirs and carry it through the dry summer. You may have heard of one famous example, the Pineapple Express, which draws its moisture from the ocean near Hawaii. In an ordinary year, these rivers in the sky are California's lifeline. But here is where the danger lives. When it is not one atmospheric river, but a relentless, unbroken procession of them, one after another, lining up across the Pacific like rail cars and slamming into the same stretch of coast for weeks on end, everything changes. Each storm dumps its load of water onto ground that is already saturated by the storm before it. The soil can absorb no more. The rivers, already full, have nowhere to put the water. The reservoirs fill to their brims and must release. The levees, holding back rivers that keep climbing, begin to strain and fail, and the water spreads out across the flat floors of the valleys, and it rises. That is precisely what happened in 1862. Not a single monster storm, but a conveyor belt of storms, running without pause for a month and a half. And this is the key to understanding a megaflood. It is not one great monster. It is a monster assembled out of dozens of ordinary storms that simply, terrifyingly, refuse to stop coming. And if that sounds like a distant historical abstraction, consider that California got a small, sharp taste of it just a few winters ago. Across the end of 2022 and the start of 2023, a rapid-fire parade of atmospheric rivers, something like 9 or more of them in the space of a few weeks, battered the state one after another. Rivers overflowed, hillsides collapsed into mudslides, and in at least one case a levee gave way and flooded an entire farming town, forcing residents from their homes in the middle of the night. Roads closed, power went out for hundreds of thousands, and the damage climbed into the billions of dollars, with dozens of people killed. And here is the crucial, humbling part. That punishing sequence of storms, as destructive as it was was still only a fraction of a true ARkStorm. It was a handful of atmospheric rivers, not the sustained 6-week onslaught of 1862. It was, in effect, a rough draft of the real thing, a preview and a warning of just how quickly a string of these rivers in the sky can bring even modern California to its knees. It was this exact threat that led the United States Geological Survey, back in 2010, to do something genuinely unusual. They assembled a large team of scientists, engineers, and emergency experts and set them a single task to rigorously model, in detail, what a modern-day repeat of 1862 would actually do to today's California, a state that is now home to nearly 40 million people and to a vast share of the food supply of the entire nation. They called the resulting scenario ARkStorm, and the name is a small piece of cleverness worth unpacking. The A and R stand for atmospheric river, and the K stands for 1,000, because in some places, the storm they modeled would bring rainfall so extreme that it might be expected only about once in 1,000 years. To build the scenario, they took two real and powerful storms from California's actual past and digitally stitched them together into a single, plausible megastorm. And then they ran the simulation forward, and they watched what it did. The results were staggering. The modeled ARkStorm flooded something like a quarter of all the buildings in the state of California. It turned large portions of the Central Valley back into that inland sea, just as in 1862. It knocked out highways, electrical power, and water systems across enormous regions for weeks and in some cases, months. It would have forced the emergency evacuation of well over 1 million people from their homes. And the estimated price tag for a single storm sequence came in at around $750 billion, with later estimates pushing that figure toward and even past a full trillion. To put a number that large into any kind of perspective, that is more than 5 times the damage caused by Hurricane Katrina. It would be, by an enormous margin, the single most expensive natural disaster in the entire history of the United States. And then, in 2022, a team of climate scientists based at UCLA and the National Center for Atmospheric Research took the scenario one crucial, unsettling step further. They set out to answer the one question that changes the entire picture. How does climate change alter the odds of all this? They called their updated work ARkStorm 2.0, and they published their findings in a leading scientific journal, and what they found was genuinely sobering. To begin with, the storm itself gets worse in a warming world, for a reason rooted in basic physics. A warmer atmosphere is able to hold more water vapor, so the atmospheric rivers of a hotter future carry more moisture and they drop more rain when they arrive. And up in the mountains, a larger fraction of that precipitation falls as rain rather than as snow, which means it runs off downhill immediately, all at once, instead of being locked up as snowpack to melt slowly over the spring. The researchers calculated that future storms could generate somewhere between 2 and 4 times more runoff in the Sierra Nevada than they would have in the past. In the words of the lead scientist, the megaflood of the future is, quite simply, bigger in almost every respect. But the most important finding of all was not about the size of the storm. It was about its probability. The researchers concluded that human-caused climate change has already, today, right now, roughly doubled the likelihood of an 1862 scale megaflood compared to just a century ago, and that risk continues to climb, more or less in lockstep with the rising global temperature. As the lead scientist memorably summarized it, the odds of a truly catastrophic California megaflood have shifted from extraordinarily rare to merely very unusual, and, he added, that is a very big problem. And then came perhaps the single most alarming sentence in the entire study. The researchers found that California's major urban centers, and they named both San Francisco and Los Angeles specifically, are now, on our current path, more likely than not to experience at least one such extreme, weeks-long storm sequence within the span of just a few decades. Read that again, because it is easy to let it slide past. Not a remote, 1 in 1,000 years abstraction to be filed away and forgotten. More likely than not, a coin flip or worse within the lifetime of most people watching this video. And here is what makes all of this genuinely, quietly dangerous, well beyond the raw numbers. It comes down to three things. The first is that almost nobody knows about it. Ask a Californian about the big one, and their mind goes instantly and automatically to an earthquake, a threat that has been drilled into the culture of that state for generations, complete with drills and building codes and emergency kits. Almost no one thinks about the flood. And yet, by some serious measures, a megaflood could actually cause even more damage and displace even more people than a major earthquake would. The state has spent a century bracing for the wrong big one. The second problem is that our flood maps are dangerously out of date. The official flood risk maps that most people and most banks and most city planners quietly rely on to decide what is safe and what is not largely do not account for a scenario on the scale of an ARkStorm, which means that vast numbers of people are living, working, and building today directly in the potential path of a future megaflood with absolutely no idea that they are at risk at all. The danger is invisible to the very tools we use to see danger. There is one place where all of these vulnerabilities converge into a single, frightening point of failure: the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. This is the vast maze of channels and islands where California's two great rivers meet before flowing out to the sea, and it is crisscrossed by more than 1,000 miles of aging earthen levees, many of them well over a century old, some little more than piled up dirt. Those fragile levees do not just protect the farms and towns of the Delta itself. They guard the beating heart of California's water system, the point from which fresh water is pumped south to supply tens of millions of people and a huge swath of the state's farmland. In a full ARkStorm, scientists expect many of those levees to fail, and if they do, salt water from the sea could be drawn deep into the Delta, potentially fouling the water supply for a large share of the state for months. A single megaflood, in other words, could deliver a 1-2 punch, drown the valley, and then poison the tap. And the third problem is the hardest. California's flood defenses, its long network of aging levees, its dams, its engineered bypass channels, were, for the most part, designed and built to handle smaller, more ordinary, more frequent floods. And there is serious, sober doubt among experts about whether that infrastructure could actually withstand a true, full-scale ARkStorm. Remember, too, that the Central Valley of today is nothing like the empty frontier of 1862. It is now home to millions upon millions of people, and it grows an enormous portion of the fruits, nuts, and vegetables consumed across the whole United States. The exposure has multiplied 100-fold since the last Great Flood. The threat itself has been slowly, steadily growing. And our defenses, and perhaps more importantly, our collective awareness, simply have not kept pace with either. So let me end, as I always try to, with honesty and with real balance, because a subject this heavy deserves clarity far more than it deserves fear. Let me be as clear as I possibly can about what this is not. It is not a prediction that a megaflood will strike California this year, or next year, or on any specific date that anyone alive can name for you. These are probabilities, not a countdown clock. A megaflood of this kind could, in principle, begin next winter, or it might not arrive for another 50 or 80 years. The ARkStorm scenario is a planning tool, a rigorous and careful what if. And it was never meant to be read as a forecast of a storm on the way. And there is real, genuine reason for hope buried in all of this. The entire purpose of ARkStorm and of the scientists who have devoted years to refining it is precisely to get ahead of the disaster, to hand engineers, emergency planners, and ordinary communities the hard information they need to strengthen the levees, to redraw the flood maps honestly, to design real warning systems, and to prepare, in the decades we may well still have, so that when the water finally does come, California is actually ready to meet it. The story of the megaflood is not, in the end, a story of inevitable doom. It is the story of a known, understood, and genuinely preparable threat that we still have time to confront. The deepest tragedy of 1862 was that no one saw it coming at all. We, today, no longer have that excuse. So the next time you hear someone in California speak about the big one and you realize they mean the earthquake, you might gently remind them that the ground beneath their feet is not the only thing that can rise up and swallow a city whole. High above the Pacific Ocean, unseen and silent, the rivers in the sky are always flowing. In most years, they are a blessing, bringing the rain and the mountain snow that keep the entire Golden State alive. But every century or two, they line up in a long and merciless procession, and they refuse to stop, and when that happens, they can turn California back into an inland sea. Exactly as they did in 1862, and exactly as they will someday do again. The water has done it many times before, long before we were here to name it. It is patient, and it is certain, and it is, slowly but unmistakably, becoming more likely. The only question that has ever really mattered is the same one it has always been, whether when the water finally comes. We have chosen to be ready for it.